When Aisha married Idris, she believed she had found the perfect man, kind, gentle, and deeply devoted. But there was something about him that never quite added up. He never spoke of his past, avoided certain questions, and occasionally disappeared without explanation. She had married a mystery, never realizing the secret he carried could change everything. When the truth finally surfaced, would she be able to accept the man she loved, or would his secret shatter their world? Aisha sat by the window, watching the golden hues of the evening sky stretch across the horizon. The soft rustling of the trees outside carried with it the familiar comfort of home. Inside their small yet cozy house, the scent of freshly brewed tea lingered in the air. She smiled as she heard Idris moving about in the next room, humming a quiet tune as he arranged the books on the shelf. She loved moments like these, peaceful, ordinary, filled with the quiet companionship that made marriage feel like a sanctuary. Yet, despite the love she felt for her husband, a nagging thought refused to leave her mind. Idris was everything she had ever wanted: kind, attentive, and patient. He knew exactly how to make her laugh, how to comfort her on difficult days, and how to listen when she needed to be heard. But there was something about him that remained just out of reach, an invisible wall between them that she couldn't ignore. He never spoke of his past. In the early days of their marriage, Aisha had brushed it off, assuming that, like everyone, he had painful memories he preferred to leave behind. She had never wanted to pressure him, believing that if he wished to share, he would do so when the time was right. But as the months passed, his silence became more noticeable. Whenever she asked about his childhood, he would smile and shift the conversation to something else. If she inquired about his family, he would simply say, "I don't have anyone left." The words were always spoken gently, but they carried a finality that made it clear she shouldn't ask further. At first, Aisha had accepted it. She told herself that love was about the present and the future, not the past. But as time went on, little inconsistencies began to surface. There were moments when he seemed to recognize strangers on the street, exchanging brief nods with people she had never seen before. Once, she had caught a man staring at Idris with something close to reverence, but when she had asked about it, he had brushed it off as a misunderstanding. Then there were the times when he simply disappeared. It didn't happen often, but every few weeks, he would leave unexpectedly, always with a vague excuse, something about handling personal matters or running an errand. He never gave details, and she never pressed him for them. But the unease had begun to build inside her, quiet at first, then louder with each passing day. One evening, as they sat together over dinner, Aisha decided to try once more. "Idris," she said carefully, watching him as he spooned rice onto his plate, "can I ask you something?" He glanced up, his warm brown eyes meeting hers. "Of course." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Why don't you ever talk about your past?" A flicker of something, was it sadness, crossed his face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He set his spoon down and folded his hands together. "I just prefer not to dwell on it," he said gently. "Some things are better left behind." "But isn't the past part of who we are?" she asked, searching his expression for something, anything that would give her a glimpse of the truth. Idris exhaled softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Aisha, I love you. You are my present, my future. Isn't that enough?" His words should have reassured her, but instead, they deepened the ache in her heart. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to believe that whatever he was hiding didn't matter. But love, she knew, was built on more than just words. It was built on honesty, on sharing the burdens of life together. And Idris was carrying something alone. That night, as she lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, Aisha realized that no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the questions wouldn't go away. She had married a man she adored, but she had also married a mystery. And sooner or later, mysteries demanded to be unraveled. The wind carried a whisper through the marketplace, rustling fabric and stirring dust as Aisha moved between the stalls. The scent of spices, warm bread, and fresh fruit filled the air, but her mind was elsewhere. She had come here for routine shopping, yet her thoughts clung stubbornly to the growing uncertainty surrounding her husband. Lately, the signs had become too clear to ignore. Idris was keeping something from her. It wasn't just his reluctance to speak about his past. It was the way people reacted to him, as if they knew him but dared not approach. The way his gaze sometimes lingered on strangers for just a moment too long before he turned away. And then there were his disappearances. The first time he had left abruptly, Aisha hadn't questioned it. He had simply told her he had something to take care of and would be back soon. But when "soon" had turned into an entire night without explanation, the unease had settled in her heart. Each time it happened, his reasons were vague. "There's something I need to handle," he would say. Or, "I promise it's nothing to worry about." His reassurances felt hollow. Aisha had tried to convince herself that he had a good reason, that perhaps he was dealing with private matters he wasn't ready to share. But then, there was that moment, the one she couldn't shake. 2 nights ago, she had woken up to find his side of the bed cold. The house was silent, the darkness pressing in around her. At first, she thought he might be outside, getting some air. But when she checked, he was nowhere to be found. She had waited, heart pounding, until the first hints of dawn. When he finally returned, there was something different about him. His shoulders were tense, his clothes slightly disheveled, as if he had been somewhere important. But what unsettled her most was his expression, worn, weary, and filled with something unspoken. Before she could ask, he had cupped her face gently, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Go back to sleep, my love." That had been the end of it. But it wasn't the end for Aisha. Now, as she handed a few coins to the fruit vendor, she caught movement from the corner of her eye. Across the marketplace, near the blacksmith's shop, stood a man she had never seen before. He wasn't browsing or engaged in conversation like the others. He was simply standing there, watching. Watching her. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned fully to look at him, expecting him to turn away. But he didn't. Instead, he dipped his head slightly in what seemed like acknowledgement. Recognition. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. Did he know her? Or was it Idris he recognized? Before she could react, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. That night, as she prepared dinner, she could feel Idris's presence behind her before he even spoke. "You're quiet today," he said, his voice smooth as always. But she heard the caution in it. She turned to face him. "Where were you last night?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "I told you, I had something to take care of." Aisha folded her arms. "That's not an answer, Idris." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, with a sigh, he walked over and gently took her hands in his. "I wish I could tell you," he murmured. "I do." She searched his eyes, hoping, praying, for something that would ease her doubts. But all she saw was conflict. "Then why don't you?" she whispered. He hesitated, and in that pause, she felt the weight of his secret pressing between them like an invisible wall. Finally, he released her hands. "Because some truths change everything." Aisha's breath hitched. She wanted to push, to demand answers. But deep down, she knew, Idris wouldn't tell her unless he had no other choice. The problem was, she wasn't sure how much longer she could wait. And after what she had seen today, she wasn't sure she wanted to wait. The weight of secrecy settled between Aisha and Idris like an unspoken barrier. Though they continued their daily routines, the silence between them felt heavier than words ever could. She could no longer pretend everything was fine, not when the unease in her heart grew stronger each day. And then there was the man from the marketplace. Aisha couldn't shake the memory of his gaze. The way he had watched her, as though he knew something she didn't. As though she was the one who had been kept in the dark. That night, as Idris lay beside her, his breathing slow and steady, she made a decision. She would follow him. It was the only way to uncover the truth he refused to share. Her chance came sooner than she expected. The next evening, just as the moon began its slow ascent, Idris stood from his chair. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. Aisha, sitting by the window, held her breath as he grabbed his cloak. "I'll be back soon," he said, his voice carefully measured. She nodded, feigning indifference. "Be safe." The moment he stepped outside, Aisha sprang into action. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she slipped into the shadows, careful to keep a distance as she followed him through the narrow streets. Her pulse pounded as she trailed behind him, weaving through alleys and side roads she rarely ventured into. Idris walked with purpose, his posture tense, as if he was anticipating something, or someone. Minutes passed, then an hour. Aisha nearly lost him twice in the maze of pathways, but each time, she found his familiar silhouette moving ahead. Then, suddenly, he stopped. Aisha ducked behind a stone wall, her breath shallow. Peering cautiously around the corner, she saw Idris standing in the dim glow of a lantern. He was not alone. The man from the marketplace stood before him. Aisha's heart hammered. Who was he? She strained to hear their conversation, her body pressed against the cool stone. You shouldn't be here. Idris's voice was low but firm. The other man exhaled sharply. I had no choice. The situation is worsening. Idris remained silent for a moment before replying, I told you I'm not returning. My life is here now. The man took a step closer. Does she know? Aisha's stomach clenched. She doesn't need to, Idris responded, his tone hard. The stranger scoffed. You can't hide forever, Idris. The past doesn't disappear just because you wish it to. Silence. Then, finally, Idris's voice softened. I know. Aisha's hands trembled. She had come looking for answers, but now that she was hearing them, fear settled in her bones. What past was Idris hiding? And why was he so desperate to keep it buried? The conversation ended with a final exchange of words too quiet for her to catch. Then, with a heavy sigh, Idris turned and walked away. Aisha barely had time to retreat before he passed by, his footsteps slow, thoughtful. She remained hidden, waiting until he was gone before stepping into the dim light. The stranger had not yet left. Summoning every ounce of courage, Aisha stepped forward. Who are you? The man turned sharply, his eyes widening in surprise. You shouldn't be here. She ignored his words. What do you know about Idris? A pause. Then, a sigh. You should ask him yourself, the man said. But be prepared. The truth is not easy to bear. And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving Aisha standing in the empty street, her world tilting beneath her feet. She had sought the truth. Now, she wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. Aisha barely slept that night. The stranger's words echoed in her mind, layering over the cryptic conversation she had overheard. You should ask him yourself. But how could she? How could she confront the man she loved, knowing the truth might break everything they had built? Morning arrived in a blur of exhaustion and unease. Idris moved through the house as if nothing had changed, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. He greeted her with a soft kiss on her forehead, his touch warm and familiar. But for the first time since they had married, she felt herself pull away. Idris noticed. Are you feeling unwell? Aisha forced a smile. I just didn't sleep well. He studied her for a moment, eyes filled with concern. She could see it, the love, the care, but now there was something else standing between them. A secret. And she could no longer pretend it didn't exist. After breakfast, as the sunlight poured through the windows, Aisha took a deep breath and spoke. Idris. He looked up from the book he had been reading, his expression open. Yes, my love. She swallowed hard. I followed you last night. The silence that followed was absolute. The book slipped from his hands onto the table, but he made no move to pick it up. His jaw tightened, his fingers curling slightly before he exhaled, slow and deliberate. Why? He asked, his voice steady but laced with something unreadable. Aisha's throat felt dry. Because I needed to know. His gaze met hers, searching. And what did you find? She hesitated before answering. I found a man who knows you. A man who spoke of a past you refused to acknowledge. A past that doesn't just belong to you, but to us. Idris closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. When he opened them, there was no anger, only a deep weariness. I never wanted you to find out this way, he admitted. Aisha's heart pounded. Then tell me the truth. A long pause stretched between them. Then, finally, he spoke. I am not the man you think I am, he began. Before I came here, before I met you, I was someone else. Someone tied to a world I no longer wished to be part of. Aisha's fingers dug into her lap. What kind of world? His gaze darkened. A world of power, responsibility, and danger. The words sent a chill down her spine. Are you running from something? Idris shook his head. Not running. I left. I walked away from a life that demanded too much of me, from a duty I never chose. But that life, it doesn't let go so easily. Aisha's breathing grew unsteady. So the men who watch you, the disappearances, they're connected to this past? He nodded. They are reminders. Warnings that I cannot escape forever. Aisha gripped the edge of the table, trying to process the weight of his words. And what does that mean for us? Idris reached for her hands, his touch gentle yet firm. It means that I must make a choice. Stay hidden, knowing they will never stop looking for me. Or return, to a life I swore I would never go back to. Aisha's chest tightened. And if you return... His fingers brushed against hers. Then I am no longer just your husband. I become someone else again. Someone bound to duties beyond this home, beyond us. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. And if you stay... He exhaled, his grip tightening slightly. Then they will come. And I cannot risk them hurting you. A heavy silence filled the room. Aisha had spent months sensing the presence of something lurking between them. Now, faced with the truth, she wished she could turn back time, to a moment when ignorance had been a comfort. But love was not about comfort. It was about choice. And now, she had one to make. She could ask him to stay, knowing they would always be looking over their shoulders, fearing the moment the past would catch up. Or she could let him go. Her heart ached at the thought, but as she looked into Idris's eyes, she saw the weight he had been carrying alone. And she knew. She could not ask him to stay at the cost of his soul. With trembling hands, she placed her palms over his. Then we go together. Idris's breath caught. Aisha. She shook her head. You are my husband. My home is wherever you are. For the first time in days, a small, broken smile crossed his face. Are you sure? He whispered. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she nodded. I married a mystery, Idris. Now, I choose to stand by his side. And with that, their fate was sealed. There was no turning back now.